Hi, thanks for joining us on today's webinar. We hope you are staying safe. We hope you're doing well. Our team here at #Paid has been working hard to gather insights on how COVID-19 is impacting consumer behavior, and we're really excited to get that to you. Walking us through the report today is Rochelle Betwigas, who is our head of measurement and insights, and our co-founder and CEO, Brian Gold. If at any point you have any questions about anything that you hear, feel free to leave us a question or email us at hello@hashtagpaid.com, and we'll do our best to get back to you as soon as possible. With that, we'll get started, and I'll pass it to Brian.
Thanks, Roger. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Brian Gold, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of #Paid. But before we get started, I wanted to talk about our Together from Home campaign. Creators have always wanted to use their influence and their voice for good, but sometimes they're not necessarily equipped with the right messages to share. At #Paid, we created 6 fact-check stories to share with our creators so that they could share the message with their followers. We were met with an overwhelmingly positive response, with over 150 stories shared by creators all across North America. Now let's get started. Rochelle Betwigas, our head of measurement and insights, as well as other teams at #Paid, came together to compile data and research to understand how COVID-19 affects marketers and our industry. Rochelle has extensive experience, including overseeing analyst teams at Nielsen, and was most recently a senior manager, insight and analytics at Edelman. After many late nights and early mornings, I'm excited to introduce Rochelle, who will be sharing our findings.
Thanks, Brian. So, before I get into the report, I want to speak about our philosophy when it comes to research overall. And as an organization, we believe in fair and holistic measurement. And to help us paint a fair picture of the landscape, we look to our partners and other thought leaders in media, digital, and retail. And we incorporated their findings with our insights to truly understand, what's happening across markets so that we can make educated predictions based on these trends. I also want to note that the situation is unprecedented and it is still evolving. So it's important that we revisit this research to understand what is the new normal once the dust has settled, and to understand, how consumer behaviors have changed in the long term because of COVID-19. Coming out of this research, our hope for you is that these findings inspire you to innovate with your brand and inspire you to continue to connect with consumers. So in this webinar, I'll first touch on how COVID-19 has evolved the way consumers shop. Second, I'll speak to how COVID-19 has evolved the way consumers are interacting with the world, particularly online. And then following that, I want to have a conversation about how brands can participate in this new and evolved landscape. So first, how consumers are shopping. So Nielsen had found that there are 6 consumer behavioral thresholds that tie directly to COVID-19 concerns. They found emerging patterns in consumer behaviors across markets and found that these patterns can act as leading indicators for future purchase habits. So for example, Canada is in threshold 4, quarantine living preparation. And I would argue parts of Canada is moving towards threshold 5 as we learn of recent lockdowns of non-essential services. But consumer behaviors within that threshold include increased online shopping, declining store visits, rising out of stocks, and strains on the supply chain. When we look at threshold 5, that's where the US sits. And parts of the US, of course, are seeing much more impact than others. And in that stage, the consumer behaviors are even more heightened. We're seeing restricted shopping trips and even more limited online fulfillment. Now, looking at threshold 6, this is a prediction of what the new normal may be. Once quarantines start to lift, we can expect consumers may return to their normal routines, but with increased health consciousness, with broader e-commerce adoption, and we may also see shifts in the supply chain. So I would say China is the first country that's likely inching towards the new normal as society starts to turn back on and plants and manufacturers start to reopen. Now let's look at these thresholds across the globe. So when we click into each region, the prevailing theme we see across markets is online sales are surging. So I want to zero in on China first. And they're inching towards the new normal as mentioned, and I think are our best signal for what's to come in the rest of the world. It's important first to level set, though, that China is a digital-first economy. They have a very robust real retail landscape that's much more mature than other markets in this world. So even despite their very strong starting position in terms of e-commerce, they still are seeing significant growth in online sales, especially in online grocery sales. So for example, Alibaba's Hema reported 220% increase. JD saw a 470% increase in their online grocery. Miss Fresh saw a 350% increase. And what's interesting is a lot of this new business is coming from elderly users. For example, Miss Fresh claimed users 40 years and older rose by 237%. And Alibaba reported a 400% increase in users 60 years and older. And what's interesting is we're starting to see this trend carry through to Canada and the US. So our partners at Dig surveyed Americans and Canadians and asked if they intended to shop online rather than going in store twice over a 10-day period. And so looking at the US first, they found that 50% of Americans intend to shop online rather than in store. But what's interesting is over that 10-day period, which is quite short, we saw a 4% increase. And when we drill down into that increase, we found majority of that came from 50 to 64-year-olds who saw a significant 14% increase in intention to shop online rather than in store. When we look at Canada, 40% of Canadians intend to shop online rather than in store. And that's a 6% increase over that 10-day period. A lot of that increase is coming from people who are 35 years old and up. Comscore is also reporting similar trends, and they found consumers visiting top retailers is highest this past week versus ever before in 2020. And we were curious to know, what does this look like by category? So our partners at Perpetua pulled Amazon sales by category for us. And there's two trends that we're especially seeing is, one, consumers are increasingly buying food online. And then two, consumers are increasingly caring about their health and wellness at this time. And if I were to, make a prediction based on what we're seeing in other markets, I could see increased spending in online grocery and health and wellness possibly continuing post-pandemic for Canadians and Americans. And so when we think about the broad adoption of e-commerce, I don't think this is a temporary trend. And I do believe that now more consumers have trialed e-commerce and have experienced the benefits of it. I think this is a behavior that's likely to stay. And, one of our partners, 2PM, even predicted that we'll likely see e-commerce shift to having up to 80% share of retail post-pandemic. And in fact, if we look to historical trends that have happened, during the 2003 SARS outbreak, we saw a significant and clear example of lasting e-commerce growth. And self-isolation was truly the boost that that country's nascent e-commerce sector needed. So for example, Alibaba became much more relevant as international buyers looked to source products online versus traveling. Taobao was developed while in isolation from SARS. Alibaba employees worked from home and family members even pitched in and to take customer calls. And what's interesting is Taobao is even, continuing on with this trend today as they saw elderly users increase adoption of their app. They created an elderly-friendly version of the app to accommodate, this newest cohort of users. And then JD had to downsize from 12 stores to 1 during the 2003 SARS outbreak out of necessity. And, that forced them to expand the e-commerce side of their business. And now, they're one of the top online retailers in the world. So based on these early trends, it's possible that history could repeat itself. And other leaders in this industry tend to agree. So we pulled in this quote from leaders in Nielsen China, and they argue that this emergence of a new retail environment amongst consumers who may have been previously hesitant to embrace online shopping are unlikely to revert to their old patterns. Okay, so I talked a lot about sped up e-commerce adoption. But in addition to that, there are also a number of trends I think will have a lasting impact on consumer purchase behavior. First, supply chain transparency. So consumers may increasingly want to understand whose hands the product has passed through before it landed in the hands of the end user. For example, we're already seeing evidence of this in China, where some delivery companies are communicating the temperature of their riders. Restaurants are communicating the hygiene steps they've taken before a dish gets to the customer. And I would say China's customers are more attentive to epidemic prevention. For example, they have almost 100% mask compliance, and that isn't the case in Canada and the US. But even still, I do think that Canada and the US will adopt some level of transparency, and we'll see elements of this being increasingly demanded amongst our consumers. All right, second, we are already seeing some evidence of this in Canada and the US, but there will likely be a lasting reinforcement of wanting to buy local. And this is driven by two trends. One is because of supply chain transparency. The more local it is, the less hands it has passed through, but also because of the rippling economic impact of the pandemic. Consumers are rallying to support local brands more. Third, value perceptions. So with wanting more visibility into the supply chain, with wanting more local products, with wanting products that certify health and safety, we'll likely see that consumers are willing to pay more for products that guarantee all of those benefits. And then finally, brand switching. So consumers have become much more fluid at this time with their priorities. And because of that, and because of necessity driven by out of stocks, consumers are trying new brands and products and experiencing the benefits of those new brands and products. And so we anticipate that this could lead to shifts in loyalty after the pandemic. Okay, so I went through a lot of information, and the likely question that is running through your minds is, what do I do with all of this information? And so this could mean innovation. It could mean changing your retail channel strategy, and it could also mean adjusting how you communicate with your consumers. And so I want to dive into that last action at a high level. How can you adjust your messaging? So for the trend of e-commerce adoption, if you are available online, this could mean educating your consumers that you are available online, especially if you are part of a category that's typically bought in a brick and mortar store, say raw pet food. Second, this means educating older audiences that are newer to this offering. And then finally, this means, if available, touting delivery or pickup in your messaging. Second, for the trend of supply chain transparency. This means, communicating where your products have been before it had arrived in the hands of your consumers and why your supply chain should be trusted. For buying local, this means focusing messaging on the fact that you are locally produced or grown or sourced. A third, for value perceptions. This means demonstrating value through messaging, particularly through the lens of health and safety, versus couponing and promotions. And I think this especially applies to categories that are higher in demand. For categories that are less higher in demand, this also means potentially offering promotions that better match the economic climate. And then finally, for brand switching. So I think more than ever before, it's important to maintain your share of your consumers' minds. Right now they're trialing a number of different brands and products because of their, fluid priorities, but also because of necessity from out of stocks. And so as they're trying these new brands and products, they're also experiencing the benefits of it. So their brand loyalty could shift post-pandemic. Okay, so now that I've wrapped up how consumers are now shopping in this landscape, I want to dive into how consumers are now interacting with this world. So Americans and Canadians are increasingly isolating, and this picture changes day by day with new developments. But we know that when stuck indoors, people will increase their media consumption. And Nielsen had predicted that this media consumption would be over 60% during this period. And the way they were able to derive that prediction is by looking at other events in the US where consumers were stuck inside. So during Hurricane Harvey in 2017, they saw a 54% increase in media consumption in Texas. During the snowpocalypse in New York in 2016, they saw a 45% increase in media consumption. Now, Nielsen was specifically speaking to TV consumption. But we now know that in 2020, consumers, and Americans specifically, are spending more time online. Up to 49% of their time is spent on their tablets, on their phones, on their computers. And the trend is the same for Canadians. And so Comscore recently reported that they're seeing increased time spent online by Canadians during COVID-19. They're also seeing a 21% increase in visits to social media websites and increases in time spent on instant messaging platforms, entertainment websites, and music websites. So what this tells me is, Canadians are seeking ways to connect with the world and their peers and family and friends, and they're also seeking ways to entertain themselves. So Nielsen and Comscore spoke about time spent online and time spent with media. But I wanted to understand, how has this impacted consumers' attentiveness and engagement? And we looked to our creator network to get a read on that. And we found that consumers are engaging with creator content on social media 2.5 times more than they used to. And that is a significant increase versus the previous quarter. When we look into this existing quarter to see where that increase came from, all of that is because of COVID-19. So we now wanted to look at how this has impacted conversation in key categories. And what we're finding is conversation has remained relatively consistent through the pandemic. So we specifically looked at online public conversation from forums and social media across a number of topics and categories. We zeroed in on positive sentiment discussion specifically so we can get an understanding of how consumer interests may have evolved generally. And what we found is consumer discussion hasn't significantly changed. So clicking into beauty, for example, conversation themes that existed prior to COVID-19 are still there. People are still talking about skincare products. They're still engaging with makeup tutorials. They're still sharing tips and tricks on forums. When we look at travel and tourism, that industry was significantly impacted by self-isolation. But when we click into positive sentiment conversation, we find that people are talking about places they aspire to go to post-pandemic. They're posting Throwback Thursday pictures. That yellow trend line for travel and tourism even sees quite a big uptick in the last couple of weeks, and that's partially driven by increased positive discussion about travel. So what this data tells me in totality is that, consumer interests still exist. They haven't gone away. And I do think there is space for brands to be a thoughtful part of these conversations. We also found that self-isolation has resulted in new interests and needs. So again, we clicked into online public conversation on social media and forums, but this time we pulled in any mention of self-isolation and self-quarantine and related phrases. And then we surfaced popular conversation themes within this overarching topic. So, some of this may not come as a surprise to you, as you've likely seen it in your own social feeds, in your own homes. But it's interesting to quantify these themes online. So first, we saw that there were over 260,000 mentions of gaming and isolation. There were over 1 million mentions of fitness and workout challenges. What's interesting is when we click into both of these themes, we find that people are doing activities that typically are in person, like cons and fitness classes, virtually. And now that people are spending more time at home, spring cleaning, organization, cooking at home, recipes are all gaining traction. What's kind of funny is bread making is especially trending right now. Mindfulness and self-care is also an important conversation theme that is gaining a lot of social engagement. People are looking for positivity right now during a period of crisis. And then finally, people are seeking to connect with friends and family. The phrases Zoom, Hangouts, and FaceTime are trending online. People are streaming video, and similarly, Netflix, Hulu, Crave, HBO are also trending online. And then people are taking this time to learn and try new hobbies, like writing and reading and gardening. So, to recap everything that we had gone through, we're finding that consumers are spending more time on social media. They're engaging with creator content more. They're continuing to talk about topics that interest them in a positive way. They're talking about their new needs and interests given their evolving context. And so, based on everything that we're finding, I think there's more room to connect with consumers online than ever before. So now I think it's important to talk about how your brand can participate in that conversation. And a phrase that I've been seeing trending on my LinkedIn feed and social media over the past couple of weeks is the importance of leading with empathy. And that can be a concept that's challenging to grasp. What does leading with empathy mean? And so I looked to what other thought leaders in this space had recommended brands do during this time to come up with, what our definition of leading with empathy is. And leading with empathy means speaking with credibility, with relatability, authenticity, and realism. So this is what our partners and thought leaders had said. So Gartner had mentioned that, people now align more closely with family, friends, and local businesses. Kantar had mentioned that, right now the most important thing for marketers to do is to suspend their own viewpoint and put themselves in the shoes of consumers. They also had said, whatever the brand strategy you take it's critical that it's seen as authentic. So you aren't seen as taking advantage of the situation. Sidley had also mentioned, it's important to be personal and address how needs are changing on a daily basis. And we find creators espouse those 4 attributes. And in the minds of consumers, creators are credible, realistic, relatable, and authentic. And, the way we've been able to come about that information is after a campaign, we survey consumers and ask how they would rate our campaign across a number of different attributes. And these are the 4 attributes that always rise to the top. And as a comparison, we also surveyed consumers and asked them to rate related non-influencer ads across the same attributes. And we found that creators are rated as being 2 times more credible, 2 times more relatable, 2 times more realistic, and almost 2 times more authentic. So now I want to pass the conversation back to Bri. And so he can speak about how creators are being leveraged during this time of need, and also what makes a creator different and impactful.
Thanks, Rochelle. A lot of great insights there. To wrap things up, I think it's really interesting that the World Health Organization, in an effort to get the message out that people should be washing their hands, partnered with popular content creator Seth Phillips, who has over 6.5 million followers on Instagram, in order to get the message out in a relatable and authentic way. If you take a look at the messaging, wash your damn hands, that's not something that's very natural for the World Health Organization to say, but it is how Dude with Sign would communicate it with his followers. And so I think this is a really great example of leveraging the relatability and the authenticity of content creators to get your message out during a time like this. However, it's really important that you're working with creators, not influencers, and there is a difference. First, creators treat their work like a craft, where influencers treat their work like a way to make a quick buck. Second, creators are proud of their content collaborations. They're only collaborating with brands that they believe in, whereas influencers, they're embarrassed by their collaborations, so they delete them as soon as they get paid. Third, creators love creating original content because they know how to engage their target audience, where influencers, they're happy to just repost anything you share with them. And lastly, creators work really hard building a trusted audience of real people who follow them, whereas influencers, they buy their followers. In conclusion, remember these 3 things. 1, times have changed. Make sure your brand communication and retail channel strategy change accordingly. 2, engagement on social media is at an all-time high, and it's an opportune channel for brands. 3, all your messaging should be leading with empathy. That means being credible, relatable, realistic, and authentic. Thank you.